Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of superficial um, secondary versus feudal primary functions. And in this video, I want to discuss things like, someone's appearance or the things that we usually find dignity and we find that we're proud of and that we find satisfaction and gratification in. In many cases, those are things like ooh, ooh, that's so pretty, or that's so beautiful. I mean, those mean something. Ooh, it makes you feel good, but you obviously, like I mentioned before, and many other times, many other people have mentioned, is that that doesn't mean much of anything. You feel good because you're escaping, not feeling like crap. That's what you're doing. You're avoiding a negative sensation, and that's why you're sort of like a whoo. You're going back to the negative sensation, like a spring. A spring. You're springing back and forth. You're springing tensions are being satisfied. Um, in many cases, that's what you're doing. You're springing and you're going right back to where you were. Same thing with hunger. Over time, you get hungry again. Same thing with any kind of physical addiction you have, like sex addiction or whatever it is, sex in general, just anything, any addiction drive that moves you or that you find satisfaction that you need to satisfy. It's because of tension. You have a buildup in sexual tension is because it's tension. You have a buildup of sex, you want it more. In many cases, over time, it's because it's tension that's building up inside of you, and you want to satisfy it. If you don't satisfy it, it can be very unpleasant. It can be good, ooh, I feel so horny, or I'm so hungry, oh, I can't wait to eat. But it can only be done so much. At the right point, at a certain point, you're suffering because you can't satisfy it. And at that point, once you realize if you're not satisfying something, and you end up suffering, even though the thing that you're satisfying can be pleasurable, and the thing that you're avoiding is the negative, and you can only do so. The thing that you're avoiding is negative. The thing that you're avoiding is negative, and the thing that you're doing by not satisfying the thing that can be pleasurable is negative. You're really sandwiched in between two negatives, and you just have to find the right point to achieve the positive. It can be a positive, and you can end up gratifying it, but to get to that point, you'll be going through more negative than it's worth to get the gratification that you want. Because you're not only avoiding coming from a place of a negative and avoiding a negative, if you go too far, you're going to be going and experiencing another kind of negative by going to the extreme. So it's finding the happy medium, I suppose, right? So you have to find the happy medium that can make all the difference in the world, I suppose, and make it worth it or not worth it. At that point, it's like, is it really worth it? Let's just get it out of the way. Let's get it done and with. I don't think this waiting, this pointless waiting, is going to make my hunger any more satisfying. It's just going to make me suffer more. It's going to be, oh yeah, I'm going to eat more, but the suffering I go through ain't going to be worth it. Let me wait 12 hours to eat instead of maybe 2 days to eat because that's just like a little too much. And the gratification I would eat would be very little more over the fact that I took 12-hour break between my meals as opposed to a 2-hour break, and the suffering just wasn't worth it, and the gratification I got in the end wasn't really much worth it. I got 5% more gratification, if you want to put a number to it, and I went through 50% more suffering, 50% more suffering than I would have. So was it worth it? No, I don't think it was worth it balancing the scales, up and down. It was kind of just not really worth it. You went through more suffering than you did to get the gratification you wanted to satisfy. In many cases, that's kind of pointless if you ask me or anyone that knows anything about life to a reasonable extent. So yes, the thing is like how you look, your appearance, this, that, or the other thing. Like I mentioned, the drives that we have, the superficial, the secondary, like how you say how your eyes look. Okay, your eyes look cool. Wow. Okay, that's a superficial secondary function that eyes have, is the appearance they perceive based on their very existence. Versus their futile primary function. Okay, they can see to perceive, but they perceive because the environment made them to perceive, so that you don't completely just fall into a ditch and die immediately after you start walking. Obviously, they're only serving, say, a function, say, specifically your eyes, so that you can avoid negative circumstances. So you can understand and see your environment to avoid obstacles, obstructions, and things that can right out just destroy you entirely. That's what you're trying to do when you have these things. You have a futile primary function. It serves a function. Yes, it serves a function, but it's serving a function to avoid a negative. And that's the point that I'm making. It serves a futile function. Obviously, it's not, say, per se, say, technically futile because you can use it to your advantage to avoid something, and you can see beautiful faces with it. But like I mentioned, it doesn't matter you're seeing the beautiful face. or whatever you're seeing that's satisfying, because that beautiful face is avoiding a negative, and you're avoiding negatives using that primary function to begin with. So you're avoiding, say, falling into ditches, a negative function of just having that, the very function of your eyes, say, is to see the environment and, use that to your advantage, and so you can, traverse your environment. But you also, the thing that you're doing is doing the thing that you're finding satisfaction in, and using that function, the primary function, the futile primary function is, okay, I can get some gratification out of it by avoiding the negatives and seeing something that's based off of a negative. Say, seeing someone's beautiful face. Ooh, her face is beautiful, but that's because you were in a negative circumstances to begin with, and it made you avoid a negative, and it made you feel good because you're escaping a negative. You're springing out of that negative that you were experiencing. And you didn't realize it. It just took something, and you didn't realize it doesn't matter if you know what it took or not what it took. It's just that if you feel gratified, it's because you were avoiding a greater negative, and you didn't realize until you were avoiding it. And it doesn't matter that you didn't realize, it's because you're still avoiding a negative, and you just didn't realize. It's more that you didn't realize how good you can have it as opposed to how bad you were in, because even if you were in a bad circumstance, you didn't necessarily feel bad. You just were in a bad circumstance relative to where you are now. But like I've mentioned before, if you've been gratified, but like I mentioned before, once you've been gratified to a certain extent, to that point, the gratification that you feel when you were to that lesser extent before becomes less, and you need that greater gratification, and that's how addiction works. So once you've felt this good, now you need this good to maintain a good feeling, unless you go long periods of time, like say a withdrawal from, say, a drug, before this can become satisfying enough again, as opposed to this where you just learn that you can achieve, or whatever it is that you were, and now it takes that to be satisfied again to a certain extent, as opposed to just content, which is really all we're going towards. Regardless of where you are, you're just getting it more and more content. You didn't realize how bad it was, or how good the contentment, real contentment, can be, because that's all you're doing. You just don't realize how good it could be, as opposed to you don't realize how bad you have it now. That's more of what it's really about. How good it can be, as opposed to really where you are now. So that means, like I mentioned, it comes down to the superficial function, the secondary, superficial secondary function, which they're both futile, but at least the primary function, say, of your eyes, serves a function. Like I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if you can see a beautiful face with that primary function. It doesn't matter if you can, do anything, because like I said, whatever you can achieve that's superficial, say looking at someone's face, that has no real function, obviously it's part of the mechanism. But it's part of a mechanism, say, to reproduce, or whatever it is, or to trick us into tomfoolery, into making us having a horrible mistake, and say driving someone else into the game, seeing a beautiful face so we can reproduce, or doing this or doing that, so we can mate. So we can do all these kinds of frivolous, pointless functions that are doing nothing but to drive on the mechanism against someone's will, our will, to continue this mechanism of pointless futility non-stop over and over again. And we're not only doing that, but we're not accomplishing anything in and of itself. It's just sitting there driving the mechanism around in a circle, chasing its own tail. So that's what we're doing. So like I mentioned before, it doesn't matter, you're avoiding it. You can see a face, okay, reproduce, whatever. It doesn't accomplish much of anything. And the same thing can be said with, okay, I'm avoiding obstacles in my environment. They're both serving the function, but the function that they're serving doesn't mean anything. And if that doesn't mean anything, to a certain extent, because you're just avoiding negatives, you're traversing your environment to avoid ditches and spiked pits that you can avoid falling in, and predators trying to rip you from limb, flesh to intestines, then that's what you're trying to avoid. Every function that we have, every sense that we have, is to drive us to avoid, say, a greater negative, and try to get us in a better state of existence, as opposed to the negative state we may have been in before. But it's because, like I've mentioned before, it's because we were in a greater negative place before than we are now, relatively speaking. So yes, in many cases, that's what it's driven off of, as opposed to, like I mentioned before, how good it can be, as opposed to how bad you had it to begin with, or where you were, relatively speaking. And like an addiction, you need that greater than over time, that greater feeling or sensation to be satisfied, as opposed to letting it happen over time. And if it's really worth it or not to wait or just get the gratification. It's about these weights that you have to consider constantly, not necessarily consciously, but it's something that's constantly going on, regardless of you understanding or knowing it, because it's existing and it's part of the mechanism. It doesn't matter if you really think about it, because that's the way many people are living. They're not really thinking about it. They're just existing. Like, oh, my circumstance sucks. It's not that life sucks. It's just, I can't wait to go to the beach and lay my feet around with my little, my little my strawberry margarita in my hands and staring at the oceans, waves, and the tide coming in and out. They can't wait. My circumstance sucks. This sucks. This specific circumstance. My job sucks. This circumstance sucks. I can't wait to go home. It's not that they realize that life sucks. It's that they realize their circumstance sucks. And that's where the biggest flaw comes into when people are, they can be understandable to a certain extent. Generally speaking, this is everyone, but in many cases, even the ones that seem to understand the most, there's always a catch-22, and the catch-22 is still not only that life, that their specific circumstance sucks, or whatever it is in their specific circumstance, or this thing, or a specific thing, or a very, marginalized, generalized, say, area that they're, say, applying it to. Even if you understand that life sucks, it's about really living that, making the difference. If you're not making the difference, even if you're making the difference, that doesn't mean you're really perceiving that. Life can suck, but you can just intellectually understand that as opposed to perceiving that, understanding it, perceiving it, having it as a part of a very controlling mechanism of how you perceive and understand reality and how that can affect the decisions you make. And it can become very personal. And it can become all-encompassing when it comes to decisions you make and all sorts of things that you do. It can be very. So, yes, I mean, like I mentioned before, if the futile function it's serving is just to avoid a negative, the futile primary function, then it's not serving much of anything but to escape a negative. They say the appearance of your eyes serves nothing more to satisfy someone else. It serves no function in and of itself, it's the appearance of your eyes, other than the projection that you have of looking in the mirror or someone looking at you, or whatever futile function, some function that you apply to it that doesn't serve as a function. Our senses serve as a function. And those really the only function that there is served here is the senses and the sentient thing. The sensing, how you sense it, and the sentience that you experience through these senses and these this interaction. So everything else that has nothing to do with these senses, this comes down to third party kind of, the corn is mine and not yours. Or I want this as opposed to that. It's value because it's given value by these things that have sentience. And if I don't have it, you have it, therefore my value goes down and your value goes up. And that's where it goes to this, what has value? Well, we have value, and these things can control the value that we are experiencing, but they're not the thing that is experiencing the value. A corn on the cob isn't experiencing the value like I am. It just can affect my value, and I still am the thing that has value, and you are the thing that has value. It doesn't matter the value, it's just the fact that there's value, and there's, or parasites, and so on and so forth. So, if it serves no function, using it as a function in of itself, it doesn't matter what you're projecting onto. Sort of like me, someone projecting onto me and saying, oh, you have a pretty face or whatever. It doesn't serve any function. It doesn't serve any innate function. It doesn't serve any function that means anything. So if the function of you seeing doesn't mean anything, the function that it serves to avoid, saying falling into a ditch or seeing someone's pretty face, that serves no function. Then the function of your pretty face, not only from someone else's point of view, but from understanding your point of view, and vice versa, doesn't serve any function, because if that primary function doesn't serve a function, whatever function it has secondarily, just by existing, by its appearance or by its smell, doesn't serve any function. It doesn't serve anything. It doesn't do anything. Obviously, it can have an effect. Okay, it has a shape, it has a geometry. It can do this. It can do that. It can serve some kind of function because it has a certain shape. It can, oh, it was too big, therefore it bumped into this and caused something else to happen, but it serves no function to the value machine innately and in and of itself. It's just something that happens to exist a certain way, and that's it, regardless. So if seeing out of your eyes, the function of your eyes is to view, and that view is to avoid a negative. To reiterate it one more time, then the way it looks or the way it smells or the way it sounds, unless it means negative, it doesn't have any value regardless of the value it has. It doesn't serve any function, as opposed to saying getting you a little giggle out of it, maybe. But it exists and it still has some function. Ooh, okay, I got some gratification out of it. Like I mentioned, it's like the corn on the cob. The secondary function is like the corn on the cob, while the primary function, like I've mentioned, is the feelings that you directly have, or the sensation that you directly have off of its function. Sort of like someone putting a hole through your eyeball or something. It serves a function that's built in, and it serves something that's having an interaction. It's one of our senses, and it's one of the things that we're perceiving through. So I think maybe the eye wasn't the best example, but our sensation, our being, our senses as a whole, our value as a whole is more important as opposed to the corn on the cob, or say the way you look, your appearance. It has an effect, but it's not as a primary effect in which you can say look at it more primarily as opposed to secondarily. It's more secondary as opposed to primary. And if the primary is kind of futile in and of itself, the secondary is kind of futile. And in a way, kind of, they're both the same thing. Because it doesn't matter if you can see out of your eye, it's still, you're just seeing to avoid a negative, and you're looking at yourself so that you don't feel bad about yourself in the end. So really, it doesn't really mean anything to look, the way it looks, what function it has innately in and of itself. It's just all the same thing. It's all just kind of, and doesn't really mean anything in the end. It just kind of has just dust in the wind. It has no function, really, other than the function that it serves to drive the addiction. And that's really it. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say. Yeah, I mean, that's really it. So, yeah, superficial secondary function versus futile primary function. You know, superficial, if it's superficial, it's pretty much futile, and synonymous, and therefore, by definition. And futile primary function, it's not superficial. I guess that's a distinction I want to make with the eye. It's not superficial. It has a primary function, the eye, but the superficial, it's still futile because it's just to do the same thing. It's to interact with this environment because it was created in this environment. If it's created in an environment, then it has to find ways to have that thing, sentient or not, interact with that environment. It's going to move around, and if it's sentient, it's probably going to have senses to interact with it. If it's made in the environment, it's going to have tools to interact in that environment. And it's going to be created by the environment to have tools to interact with the environment because it was made inside of the environment to begin with. So, really, that's what it really means in the end. So, like I mentioned, primary and secondary function. The eye can see, the nose can smell, the eye and the ears can hear. Every part of my sensation, my hands can touch, and so on and so forth. And I can taste too. I was thinking in the last sense. Run your sixth sense, your thoughts, your projection. Yes, your projection. So yes, you can do all those things. They all have their primary function: smell, to see, sight, and they all serve a function is usually avoid poison berries, so you don't, poison yourself or whatever it is. But they serve a primary function. They can smell. The way your nose looks, or this or the other thing, is the difference between the superficial, secondary, say, whatever you want to apply, function, appearance, whatever it may be, as opposed to the futile primary function. And if the primary function is futile, the smelling is pointless, just to avoid this or that, to feel better, because you're in a negative state of mind relative to now where you are in a better state of mind, say, or you're seeing and you see satisfying, oh, they're pretty, ooh, I get a little high, ooh, my pants, my little wiener's a little hard, my little butthole's a little, twitchy, a little tight. Then yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, it doesn't serve anything. Like the corn I mentioned, it serves no function. It's just as superficial as the sight of corn seeing you, as opposed to the corn satisfying your hunger. But the corn still serves a function of your hunger and your taste and the need to satisfy something. So therefore, the corn has more function than, say, looking at yourself in the mirror, because at least, even though it's secondary, it still serves a function, interaction with you that has to do with satisfying a hunger or drive that keeps you in a more it's a direct interaction more than, say, something, than looking or smelling something that smells good, or seeing something. Or the way it looks itself, the way your nose looks, or the way your olfactory function looks. It doesn't matter as much as, say, the primary function, but they're both kind of pointless in the end, because if it's futile here, it's futile superficially, and they're both kind of futile anyway, because they're about avoiding negatives anyway to begin with, and it's all projection anyway. It's just coming from your mind. Mind's all you have, but it still means something, but it's still just a projection. Your projections oftentimes don't mean much of anything, and are often wrong in many circumstances. So yes. So your superficial secondary versus your futile primary function, that's a good way of wording it, I suppose. And then many cases, they're both superficial. I mean, if you want to really think about it, they're both futile. They're both more futile than they are superficial. So yes, superficial and secondary. So primary and secondary. And I guess that's the distinction I wanted to make. Yes, you can see and smell, and that, since you can smell out of your nose, it doesn't matter how it looks, and it's superficial regardless. So it doesn't matter how it looks or seems or whatever it is. It has a function, and the function means something, but function doesn't mean something other than to avoid something else. So, I don't think there's anything much else to say, except, yes, that's the proper description in describing these things. So, it's a good explanation using eyes and noses and things as examples because they have a primary and secondary function as opposed to just being futile or superficial. Because those are finer distinctions than saying describing something as futile or not futile or superficial or not. I think secondary and primary are more descriptive than superficial or futile. But they're both useful, and they both get down to the same basic idea. Yes, so anyway, just trying to buy time to see if there's anything else I can think of in the subject, but I guess I don't want to go on too long. So yes, if I have anything else more to say on this subject, I can mention it before, and yes, superficial, secondary whatever, versus futile primary function, and the distinctions. So thank you, and until next time. Bye.